The Israelis are by far the more high-tech military, but Hamas has the advantage of knowing the terrain, knowing the tunnels, and being the defender. You need at least 3-1, at least three attackers to every one defender. You probably need a lot more. I'm Tim Marshall. I write about foreign affairs.
We've already seen that there's been some Israeli raids in Gaza as an attempt to try and find hostages, clear areas from terrorists, weapons. When do you see that there will actually be an Israeli ground offensive?
I think they're pretty much ready to go. And in fact, you can't keep that many people who are leashed, but straining at the leash. You can't actually maintain that. I would argue for more than a few more days. Remember that 300,000 of these people are reservists and they have jobs, and it's actually hurting the Israeli economy. That said, it's pretty clear to me that Qatar is working very hard behind the scenes to try to get some sort of hostage negotiation going between Hamas and the Israelis, and Qatar are the go-between. And I think that is what is restraining them at the moment.
Because also the US has been calling for Israel to delay a ground invasion for potential hostage talks. Do you think that Israel will delay it? As you mentioned, there's economic problems here as well.
I'm not sure they can delay a ground offensive much longer. 300,000 reservists, all with jobs. This is hurting the Israeli economy. You can't stay on high alert that long. But they might give it a little bit more time because it's clear Hamas via Qatar is now involved in some sort of negotiations about the hostages. So that might just give a little bit more time.
So you wrote that to dismantle Hamas, basically troops will have to go into both streets and into the tunnels. Could you elaborate more on that?
Urban warfare is among the hardest military operations. You do genuinely have to go house by house and then actually room by room. And when you've cleared them, you then actually need to leave some people in them, otherwise they will simply be reoccupied. So it's close quarter fighting. The defender can go into really strong defensive points, and that includes, let's say, for example, a collapsed high-rise building. Because if you've got 15 layers of concrete on top of you, you're impervious to airstrikes. You're almost impervious to tank shells. And so what you are dealing then with is infantry. And that puts them on much more of a level playing field. Now, the Israelis will have to cross about a mile of open ground. That shouldn't be too hard for them. And then immediately they will come up against where the streets begin. And then you've got about 6 miles of streets before you get to the coast. Underneath those streets, at the minimum, tens of miles, in the high tens of miles of tunnels. Hamas talk about almost 300 miles. That could be an exaggeration, but tens of miles of tunnels. The Israelis know where many of the exit points are. They're often built within schools or next to hospitals. Hamas have a command bunker underneath one of the main hospitals. The Israelis know that because they built it when they occupied Gaza. And that, again, is incredibly difficult, especially when the Israelis know there's more than 200 hostages down there underground.
What would you say would be the main challenges facing the Israeli army in this offensive?
The Israelis don't know how many anti-tank weapons Hamas has. And if you knew about this operation a long time in advance, you probably would have stockpiled them. But they don't know how many. For example, there's one called the Cornet, which they think they might have. They've certainly got a lot of RPGs, and they have learned how to sort of do a swarm attack of RPGs where you fire many of them simultaneously at the tank. And also the Israeli armored personnel carrier, which is the strongest, most mobile in the world. Secondly, Hamas has been studying carefully drone warfare between Russia and Ukraine. So have the Israelis. And the Israeli tanks and other vehicles will probably go in with cages built along the top to prevent the small copter drones dropping very high explosives down onto them, because that diffuses the blast. So that's the first two things. They don't think Hamas has surface-to-air missiles, shoulder-launched, ones that can actually bring down planes and helicopters. They don't think they have, but they might have. What the Israelis do have to counter this is very good radar, very good intelligence, very good forward reconnaissance. They have Sayeret Matkal, that's their version of the SAS. They have the Duveden unit, another commando unit that can operate within populations. They have a tunneling, combat engineers called Yahalom, and they work alongside Oket's unit, and the Oket's unit is the K9 unit. They also have a lot of robotic weaponry and robots that can actually go down into the tunnels ahead of actual troops going in. So the Israelis are by far the more high-tech military, but Hamas has the advantage of knowing the terrain, knowing the tunnels, and being the defender. You need at least 3 to 1, at least three attackers to every one defender. You probably need a lot more.
And you mentioned hostages potentially being in tunnels. How difficult would it be for the Israeli army to locate hostages in these tunnels, especially as you mentioned, this 3-to-1 ratio?
Given that there are at the very minimum tens of miles of tunnels, you don't know where they are. When you think you might have a better idea, how do you know which, let's say if they did infrared or robots with night vision or whatever, how do you know which are fighters and which are hostages? Very hard to tell. They can be moved around very easily. They may be in parts of tunnels which have been rigged with explosives that would be blown if you went through them, killing hostages. This is their biggest challenge. Militarily, they can fight their way through the streets to the beach. Excuse me. Militarily, they can even fight their way through the tunnels. But the restraining factor is the fact that there are more than 200 human shields down there, including children.
Tunnels can be used offensively and defensively, can't they? So do you think that with tunnels potentially being used for example, for like surprise attacks on the ground, do you think that's something that the Israeli army is cautious about at the moment?
The Israelis also know that the tunnels can be used by Hamas for offensive purposes. They know exactly where they are and where they come out. The Israelis think they know where they come out, but supposing there are ones that they don't know about, which is probable, and they have gone forward with a specialist unit, and suddenly popping up behind them are 20 to 30 extremely well-armed Hamas gunmen, that is going to be a real problem, and it is why they're going to need so many, because you clear a house, you need to leave people there. You advance forward, you need to leave people to watch your back. It's going to be, if it happens, it's going to be extremely bloody on all sides. In 2014, there was a much smaller operation called Protective Edge. The Israelis went in with about 75,000 troops, and they lost 66 soldiers in 50 days. This would be a lot worse than that. One thing that people don't understand about the IDF is they say, oh, well, they've got 150,000 standing army and the rest of them are just reservists. That's the wrong way of looking at it. It's the other way round. The standing army is primarily made up of recruits with limited experience and especially limited combat experience. It's actually the reservists that are the core of the combat troops, because they're the ones who've probably had experience in 2 or 3 different conflicts, who are older and who go back for training every year. So, it's wrong to say only reservists. The reservists are actually the most of the warfighting troops.
There are recent reports about how on one of the Hamas fighters, they found a chemical weapons manual. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think that's actually a potential threat here?
Given what we've seen on October the 7th, in the event they had a chemical weapon, it's quite probable they would use it. It's not an easy thing to make. It's possible they've had them smuggled in, but the actual evidence that the Israelis presented is from a cookbook, shall you say, a terrorist cookbook that is quite well known in jihadi circles of how to do it yourself. So probably they've been looking at it and trying to get it. Getting it, a lot harder.
So we've also seen, Hezbollah's at play at the moment. Also, discussions with Iran, things like that. How do you think those actors will influence an Israeli offensive if there is to be one?
If the Israelis choose to go in on the ground in Gaza, the potential of widening the war because Hezbollah come in from the Lebanese border will not stop them. If they have to meet their war aims by doing that, they will do it. Now, it is a gamble, but so far, what the Hezbollah have done in the north on the Lebanese border is made the border hot enough. It's a calibrated act. You make it hot enough to pin about 100,000 Israelis troops against that border so they can't be used elsewhere. But you don't make it so hot that you get dragged into the war. And secondly, and directly connected to this, the people that train, arm, and fund Hezbollah are the Iranians. And everything coming out of Tehran suggests they want to verbally support Hamas, but they don't want to get dragged in themselves. And it's the same when you look at the language coming out of Hezbollah. It's actually the same when you hear the language coming out of Washington and Jerusalem, because they are both saying, we have no hard evidence that Iran was behind this. Now, they probably think Iran was behind this, but they don't want to say that because then you'd have to do something about it. So once you move outside of Hamas, at the moment, it's still possible that even a ground war will not necessarily trigger a wider war. If it does, Iran has something called the unity of arenas. It's this concept they have. And the arenas are the northern front in both Lebanon and Syria, then the eastern front, which is the Palestinian West Bank, and then the southern front, which is Hamas in Gaza. And all those operating at the same time is the unity of arenas that would give the Israelis a really, really hard time. At the moment, it's still not there. It's just one real front.
And what about the West Bank at the moment? Do you think that would pose a challenge?
The West Bank's already pretty hot. I think it's around 50 Palestinians have died there since October the 7th. Hamas is actually quite strong in the West Bank now, even though it's ruled by the Palestinian Authority and Fatah. But it's in, again, it's in, I mean, there is genuine rage in the West Bank, but it's also in Hamas's, it's to their advantage to make it as hot as possible to keep the Israelis distracted and looking that way as well. With the ground war in Gaza, the West Bank would probably heat up even more. But again, the PA, led by Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian president who's 88, out of touch and losing support quickly, nevertheless, the political structure there will do its best for there not to be outright war in the West Bank. At the moment, it's still all on Gaza.
There's been suggestions that this potential offensive, it could potentially last for, if not weeks, months. We've seen that there are still civilians who are in the north of Gaza. Some civilians are returning to the north of Gaza. What would life be like for those civilians if they're caught up in this offensive? Especially, we're already struggling with aid to even get in.
Israeli government's trying to persuade Israelis in the north not to go back north. Tens of thousands have been moved down south. But how long can you live like that? It costs money. You've got a job to go to. Did you leave your pets behind? There's 1,000 reasons to go back, but there's one very good reason not to. And that is if the northern front goes up. Hezbollah has, it is said, up to 150,000 rockets. Far, far more than Hamas have, and they're better, longer range. They have at least a 50-mile range, and some of them have a 400-mile range. They can reach anywhere in Israel. And many of them hundreds of them have guided systems. It means you can actually put them where you want as opposed to just firing them willy-nilly. And they also have some extremely good battle-hardened troops who have been fighting in Syria for the past 10 years. And they have their own special forces units. So Hezbollah's military capability is a good reason not to go back. But the longer things haven't gone bang in the north, the more people want to go back.